The morning the horses refused to drink was also the morning my husband came home with blood on his boots. Chapter 1. The Water Turned First Word. Count 9 to 10. Word. Narrated by Clara Hensley. New Mexico Territory, 1883. They say you can trust a man by how a horse responds to him. But no one ever talks about what it means when the horses turn on the land itself. It was early June when the air began to crackle different, not with lightning, but with something quieter, something meaner. Our ranch, 30 acres of dry hope and memory, sat along Willow Creek, a silver thread that had never failed us. Not once, until that morning. I had risen before sunup, habit not choice. The heat hadn't yet curled the edges of the porch, but I could already feel its breath on the back of my neck. I wore my work dress, the one with the frayed hem Ward kept saying he'd patch, but never did. I fed the chickens, checked the barn, and walked the fence. It was on that circuit I noticed our 6 horses clustered by the wooden fence, refusing to go near the water trough. Their bodies were still, but their ears were pinned back, their heads low. Zora, my mare, gentle as butter, usually snorted and sidestepped when I tried to coax her toward the creek. That's when I knew it wasn't stubbornness. It was fear. I called for Ward. He didn't answer. The only sign of him was his saddle missing from its peg, and his boots were gone. I found him 2 hours later riding in from the east pasture. His face was streaked with dust, and something dark clung to his left boot, blood dried and brown. My throat tightened. "What happened?" I asked. He dismounted, avoiding my gaze. "Coyote," he muttered. "Got into the traps." "But we didn't set traps. Not since last fall." I stared at him, but he just walked past me, the scent of smoke and sweat trailing behind like a whisper I couldn't catch. That afternoon, I went to check the creek myself. The water still flowed, clear, fast, almost cheerful as it danced over the rocks. But the horses wouldn't touch it. They stayed back, clustered together, their bodies trembling. I knelt, cupped the water in my hands, and brought it to my lips. It smelled fine, tasted normal, and yet something in my belly curled. That evening, Ward didn't touch his supper. He sat on the porch, staring into the distance, sipping his whiskey like it owed him an answer. I watched him from the doorway, the lantern light slicing his face in half. One side, calm. The other, unreadable. "You were gone a long time," I said. He grunted. "Had things to check on. You said it was a coyote." It was, but his voice had that flatness. The kind that meant he'd already built a wall around the truth and wasn't about to let me peek over. After he went to bed, I stayed awake listening to the night sounds. But something was off. The crickets were too quiet. The wind had a metallic edge. Even the frogs seemed afraid to speak. I rose before dawn the next morning and rode Zora upstream, past the familiar bends and cottonwoods, past the place where the wild roses used to bloom. I kept riding until I found something I didn't expect to find. A circle of disturbed soil. Recently turned. The earth was dark and wet in patches, as if something had been buried in a hurry. Something the water had tried to carry away but couldn't. My stomach twisted. I dismounted, walked toward the spot, and knelt. That's when I saw it. A small scrap of fabric caught on a root. Pale blue, torn, stained. Expensive. Not homespun like mine. Not something any woman out here would wear on a daily basis. Then I saw the faintest glimmer beside it. Something round. Gold. A ring. I didn't touch it. I couldn't, because just as I reached out, I heard hooves behind me. "Ward." He looked down at me, at the fabric, at the ring. And then, without a word, he stepped forward, plucked the ring from the mud, and stared at it like it might vanish if he blinked. "What is it?" I asked, even though I already knew. He didn't answer. He just turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted. "We're not telling anyone," he said, and rode off. I stood there a long time, after staring at the water, the fabric, the place where the earth had opened to whisper its secret. When I finally climbed back on Zora and rode home, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The horses had been right. The land was poisoned, and so was the man I once loved. Chapter 2. What if the devil didn't bury her? What if he watched me walk past and said nothing? The night my husband returned with blood on his boots, he slept like a man with nothing to answer for. I stayed awake, lying stiff beside him as the moon carved shadows across the ceiling. He smelled of horse sweat, old whiskey, and something else, something sour that clung to the threads of his shirt like rot in the walls of a church. He didn't touch me, not even to shift the blanket we'd once fought over in the coldest months. I watched his back rise and fall in rhythm and wondered how a man could be so quiet after standing above a grave. At dawn, he was gone. Again. His saddle was missing. So was the shotgun. But the horses still wouldn't drink from the creek. Zora pawed at the ground like something lay beneath it, something wrong. Her eyes found mine with a pleading I'd never seen before, as if she were asking me to do what Ward could not, or would not. I didn't go to the sheriff. I didn't trust him, not after what I was beginning to understand. Instead, I rode to the only man in the territory who could look at death and not flinch, Ezra Callan. They used to call him Preacher Ghost. Said he came back from the war with too many names on his conscience and none left to write on a tombstone. But I'd seen him mend a broken leg on a colt with more care than some mothers gave their children. Ezra wasn't a ghost. He was what came after one. He was outside his cabin when I arrived, splitting wood with steady rhythm. He didn't stop when he saw me. "You're early," he said. "I found something," I replied. Or rather, Ward did. I told him everything. The fabric snagged on the root. The ring. The silence. The weight of it. He wiped his hands on his trousers, set down the axe, and looked at me with those cold water eyes. "Did you see the initials LM?" He closed his eyes. "Louise." His voice said the name like a prayer, already too late. We rode together in silence. When we reached the bend in the creek, I felt my body tense like the horses had before. The air changed there. The smell, too sweet, cloying, unnatural. Ezra dismounted first, moving like a man who's walked battlefields barefoot. He knelt and brushed the earth with his hand. "She's still here," he said, not as a guess, but a knowing. I watched him din it with a shovel, but with his fingers careful, as if unwrapping a relic. And there among the loose dark soil, the hem of blue fabric returned, like a ghost showing its own wound. He held it, stared, then turned to me. "She didn't die quickly. I couldn't stop the sickness from rising." I looked away, my breath shallow. That's when Ezra froze. His hand reached deeper into the dirt and pulled out something dull crusted in rust. A badge. Sheriff's star. I stepped back instinctively. He turned it over in his palm. The back had initials etched into it, faded but legible. E. Emery. I shook my head, hoping he would too. "The sheriff," I whispered. Ezra nodded. Or someone wearing his truth. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. We'd let that man into our home, served him pie and coffee, let him pat the heads of our neighbors' daughters. He had led the search for Louise, called it a lost cause by the third day. Why I asked, though, I didn't want the answer. Ezra didn't answer. He stood brushing the dirt from his hands. "We can't go to him." "Ward won't speak," I added. "He doesn't need to," Ezra replied. "His silence already has." We rode back to the ranch as the sun lowered into the hills. The shadows stretched long across the dry land, and even the chickens were quiet. Ward's horse was tied at the post. My stomach turned. He was on the porch, rocking in the chair he never used unless something troubled him. A bottle hung loose in his hand. The rifle leaned against the wall. He saw us approach and stood. "You shouldn't have brought him here," Ward said. "You found the ring, Ward," I said. "You held it in your hands." "I buried it," he snapped. "That should have been enough." "You buried her too?" I asked. His eyes flared, but he said nothing. And in that silence, the answer dripped like blood off a blade. "I didn't kill anyone," he said finally. "No," I replied. "You just rode past when the ground was still warm." Ward looked at Ezra. "You think you can come here, preach over my land? Tell my wife what to think." Ezra didn't move. "I came because your wife still listens when the earth speaks." Ward's face twisted. "This isn't about land. This is about pride. about men trying to be heroes when they should stay out of things that don't concern them. She was a girl, I said, my voice low. 18. Red hair? You told me once she reminded you of your sister? He turned his back, walked inside, and shut the door without another word. Ezra didn't follow. Neither did I. Instead, we stood there until the sun died behind the mountains. The creek gurgled below us, no longer cheerful. Just tired. Just waiting. Ezra broke the silence. There's a schoolteacher in town, he said. Martha Brewster. Lost her sister in a so-called raid 5 years back. She knows what silence costs. I nodded. We go at first light, I said, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something stir in my chest that wasn't fear. Not quite hope, but maybe the part of hope that sharpens the blade. Chapter 3. What do you do when the man with the law on his chest is the one who buried her? The schoolhouse was still asleep when we rode into town, the sun barely parting the cold breath of morning. I'd never knocked on its door for anything but a parent meeting or a harvest recital. But that morning, I came with a star in my pocket and a war in my chest. Martha Brewster answered before I could knock. She must have seen us from the window, Ezra beside me, silent as ever, and my gloves still stained with creek soil. I've been expecting you, she said, eyes sharp as broken glass. I didn't know how to begin, so Ezra stepped forward and held out the sheriff's badge. The metal was dulled, but the name was still there, E. Emery carved into it like a curse. She took it without hesitation, turning it over in her palm. Where'd you find it? Up the bend at Willow Creek, I said. Near cloth from Louise McAllister's dress. The wind shifted behind her. She didn't flinch. You're sure it's hers? She was wearing pale blue, I whispered. Same as the one caught in the roots. Martha's jaw set like a hinge about to break. She came to me the day she disappeared, she said quietly. Said she'd seen something. Asked what it would mean if a man buried something behind the jailhouse late at night. She didn't say who, but she was shaking so bad she couldn't hold her pencil. Ezra's hand rested lightly on the doorframe. You believe us then? Martha looked at him, then at me. Her eyes lingered a second longer on my face, maybe seeing the lines grief had sketched there, the kind only another woman would notice. I believed you before you came. It just hurts more to say it out loud. She disappeared inside and returned moments later with a leather ledger and an old silver whistle that had once belonged to her father, the town's first marshal. If we do this, she said, we do it loud. We walked, not rode, to the square. By the time we reached it, market day had begun stirring, carts full of peaches and dried meat, voices bartering over flour sacks, a child dragging a one-eyed doll through the dust. It was the kind of day that makes people believe nothing terrible can happen in their town. But evil doesn't announce itself. It buttons its coat. It smiles. It wears a badge and says good morning. And there he was. Sheriff Emery, leaning beside the feed store, tipping his hat to a widow in lavender. His boots polished, star-gleaming voice, too smooth for a man who once told me, justice rides faster than gossip, and it shoots straighter. He spotted us. His smile cracked. Just a flicker. Morning, folks, he called out, his tone easy as molasses. Didn't expect to see the preacher and the schoolmarm walking side by side. What brings you into town, Clara? He said my name like a nail being tapped, waiting for a hammer. Martha stepped forward. The badge in her hand caught the light. You dropped this, she said. He didn't take it. You're mistaken. No, she replied. You're mistaken if you think we're still blind. People began to slow. The butcher froze mid-slice. A child tugged at her mother's apron. The air stilled. Ezra's voice, low and heavy, joined hers. We found it beside the body of Louise McAllister. Emery's laugh was too quick. You found fabric, maybe. That creek washes down from the hills. Anything could end up there. Martha raised her ledger. She came to me trembling. Said she saw someone burying something behind your office. She asked if I thought justice could be trusted. I told her yes. I think I lied. Emery's jaw clenched. You three show up with stories and scraps trying to hang a man with speculation. You want to tear this town apart? No, I said, stepping forward. We want to stitch it back together. Then something shifted. Henry Lowe, the blacksmith, moved closer. His daughter had vanished 2 summers ago and off, they said. But she'd left her boots on the porch. Beside him came Abigail Mendez, the boarding house keeper, her fists clenched around the apron where she once found a bloodied scarf tucked beneath a stranger's mattress. One by one they came, not shouting, not armed, just standing. We weren't a mob. We were a mirror. And Sheriff Emery didn't like what he saw. His hand moved toward his holster, slow, calculated. But the people closest Henry Abigail, the pastor's son, stepped forward in unison. He froze. I saw it then, the unraveling. Not the kind that comes with gunfire, the kind that comes when power realizes it no longer holds the room. He ran. Not fast, not smart, just desperate. Through the alley behind the bakery, kicking up dust like a kicked dog. Ezra and 2 others followed, but I didn't move. I stood there, breath shallow, heart hammering. Martha stood beside me, her shoulders square, her eyes wet but unbroken. You started it, she said. No, I replied, voice thick. You taught us how to finish it. By nightfall, Emery was caught hiding in a dry well behind Netless Barn. By morning, Louise had a grave with flowers and her full name carved in pine. And by noon, the badge that once protected a killer now lay nailed to the jailhouse door. The wind picked up around noon. It swept the square clean like nothing had happened. But we knew, and we remembered. Justice hadn't ridden in from some distant fort on a white horse. It had walked up dusty streets in the boots of women no one had listened to. Until now. Chapter 4. What if? Justice cleans the creek, but not the marriage that fed from it. The morning after they pulled Sheriff Emery from that dry well, the creek sang like it had forgiven us. The horses drank freely again. Even Zora, who had sidestepped every drop for days, stepped into the shallows and lowered her head. Her muscles eased, her breath deepened, and I stood there barefoot in the mud, pretending that meant something. But the truth was, even if the water had turned clear, something in me remained clouded. Behind me, the house was still. Ward hadn't come to bed last night, at least not while I was awake. I'd heard the porch boards creak around midnight, the scrape of his boots, the soft clink of a bottle set down hard. That was the rhythm of our nights now, grief in separate rooms, silence in shared walls. I found him sitting on the edge of the porch when the sun finally broke the sky. His eyes were on the hills, but I knew he wasn't seeing anything out there. I handed him a tin of coffee. He took it without thanks, the way a man accepts the morning without deserving it. I didn't know she was dead, he said after a long silence. Just thought she'd gone off. Girls do that sometimes. You saw her ride past. He nodded slowly. She looked nervous. I figured it was boy trouble. I didn't ask. You saw the ring. I buried it. You saw a grave and covered it. He didn't flinch. Just looked at the horizon like the sun might offer forgiveness if he stared hard enough. I didn't think it was my place, he said. I studied the man I'd shared years with. The hands that once held mine after a miscarriage. The shoulders that had carried feed sacks and bad news. The mouth that had spoken vows and then gone quiet year after year. Not doing wrong doesn't make a man good, I said. Sometimes it just makes him polite while evil works beside him. Ward didn't reply. Maybe he'd stopped speaking truths long before Louise ever rode past him. I left him there, tied my shawl tighter, saddled Zora, and rode to town for the vote. Ezra was already waiting near the split-rail fence by the cottonwoods. He was dressed in black today, as if mourning something beyond the sheriff. Maybe he was. Maybe he always was. You sleep? He asked. No. Me neither. We rode in silence, the kind that sits in your ribs and grows teeth. When we reached town, the square was full. More than I expected. Word spreads like thunder when it carries both justice and gossip. The storefronts looked smaller somehow, as if they were holding their breath. The people stood close like they were trying to believe in their own courage. Martha stood near the meeting house steps. Her boots were dusted, her ledger clutched like scripture. Behind her was Henry Lowe, arms crossed, eyes fixed. A man who had carved Louise's name into pine with the same care he once reserved for wedding bands. The names for interim sheriff floated through the crowd. All men. All familiar. A cousin of Emery's. A ranch foreman who once took bribes for water rights. A deputy who had turned away too often. but no one said Martha's name. Not until I did. She found the truth I said loud enough for the murmurs to pause. And she didn't run from it. That's more than I can say for most men I've known. There was silence. The kind that waits to see who'll breathe first. Then Abigail Mendez said, "Let her do it." And Henry added, "She's already protecting us better than any badge ever did." One by one, hands lifted. Not all, but enough. Martha Brewster became the law of our town. There were no parades, just a quiet reshaping of power. Afterward, I walked to the edge of town where Louise had been laid to rest beneath the cottonwood. The marker was simple, her name, carved into wood that still smelled of sap. Someone had left fresh sage and a piece of blue ribbon knotted tight around a nail. I knelt there, tried to say something, anything, but all I could manage was, "I'm sorry I didn't shout sooner." Behind me, Ezra approached. He placed something small beside the ribbon. A carving. A horse smoothed from creek willow legs outstretched like it was running towards something better. "She once told me she hated side saddles," he said. Said the world tried to make girls ride like they were afraid of their own speed. I touched the carving with careful fingers. It was warm from his palm. "She would have liked you," I whispered. He didn't reply, just looked at the creek in the distance. The water shimmered like forgiveness, but I knew better than to trust reflections. "What now?" I asked. Ezra took a long breath. "Now we see who comes next. Power doesn't disappear. It just looks for a new coat to wear." When I returned home, Ward was gone. His boots, his coat, his rifle. The rope he used to tie the gate was missing too. He hadn't left a note. Only the coffee tin still warm from the sun. And for the first time, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt freed. But freedom isn't always joy. Sometimes it's just the absence of watching someone rot inside their silence. As the sun set, I stood by the creek again. Zora beside me, the willow branches shifting in the breeze like fingers brushing a wound that was learning to scar. And I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. Was justice done? Or had we just buried the wrong kind of truth? Chapter 5. What if the ghost wasn't her, but the life I lived before I spoke her name? 3 weeks after they dragged Emery from that dry well, the creek ran clear. Zora drank again, without hesitation. The cattle followed hooves steady on soft earth. The birds came back to the sycamores. Nature forgave fast when the rot was cut out. But people carried memory like a second spine. And I carried mine in silence. I spent most mornings walking the fence line alone, boots soaking with dew, watching shadows shrink beneath the rising sun. The house was too quiet, without Ward's habitual movements, the cough before coffee, the curse at loose hinges. He had left without a word, but not without a trace. In the barn, I found the feed sacks stacked just right, the broken gate mended with care, a pair of gloves left folded on the rail, his worn thin at the palms. No note, just small acts of apology from a man who'd never learned how to say the word. He wasn't coming back. I knew it, and I didn't ask the world to fix it. Ezra came by with supplies like always. Sometimes we'd speak. Other times we just stood at the creek's edge watching the water move as if it could carry the past downstream. One evening, he handed me something wrapped in oilcloth, a thin book of hand-stitched prayers worn soft at the corners. "These aren't to save you," he said. "They're to remind you you're already saved." I'm not sure I believe that. That's why I brought it. He didn't touch my hand, but his eyes lingered like he might. That night, I sat by candlelight and read a single line aloud, "Let her name outlive her silence." I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt. The trial was set for the following week. I received the summons the next morning, folded neat inside Martha's ledger paper. She handed it to me herself. "Your words carry," she said. "Let them land true." On the day of the trial, I wore a soft blue dress, the same color Louise had last been seen in. I tied my hair back tight, not for modesty, but for clarity. I wanted them to see my face. The courtroom smelled of old wood sweat and the iron tang of dread. Emery sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit. His hands rested too still. He looked thinner, smaller. Evil often does when it's no longer standing on a platform. I took the stand third. My voice didn't tremble. I spoke of the horses, the creek, the ring, the badge, the burial. I spoke of the moment I chose not to stay silent. And when the defense lawyer asked why I'd waited so long, I looked him straight in the eye. Because I'd spent most of my life being taught that a woman's voice was dangerous. Turns out they were right. But not in the way they meant. The room was silent. Then Martha testified. She read aloud from her ledger a list of named stories and whispered confessions. Girls who had seen too much. Women who had been touched, then dismissed. She read until the room couldn't look away. Ezra was called to confirm the discovery of the badge. And then the defense made their move. They called a man named Hatchone, of Emery's old friends. Hatch claimed Emery was with him that night, said they were fixing fence lines, said no way he could have buried Louise, but his hands shook, and when asked to point out Emery's ranch on the map, he couldn't find it. The jury saw. They weren't deaf to fear, but they were done being its prisoner. Guilty. The word rang through the courthouse like thunder cracking an old tree. But it wasn't the gavel that made my knees buckle. It was what happened after. When I stepped outside, the town didn't turn from me. They turned toward me. They nodded. Quietly. Reverently. Like they saw not the woman who'd stirred up trouble, but the one who refused to let truth drown. Ezra found me at the hitching post. You did it, he said. No, I said. She did. And I meant it, because Louise had never truly left. She had stayed in the creek, in the roots, in the air that made the horses nervous, in the gut feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. She had waited, not to haunt me, but to see if I'd carry what she could no longer hold. That night, I returned to the creek alone. I wore the same blue ribbon I had placed on her grave. I stood barefoot in the water, eyes closed, letting the current pass around my ankles like a benediction. I whispered her name once, then again, and I promised her I'd never forget the sound of her silence. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Ezra didn't speak, just joined me in the water. The moon lit his face, the kind of quiet peace only a man who's walked away from war and into truth can carry. He reached for my hand, and I let him. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. Some tenderness is loudest when it lingers. The creek flowed steady, not as a witness anymore, but as a reminder. Justice had come, but it would never be finished. And two would spend the rest of my life making sure no girl rode into silence without someone listening. The ghosts didn't haunt me now. They walked beside me, and they finally knew I could hear them. The story you've just followed isn't only about a woman named Clara or a town shaken by a buried truth. It's about what happens when silence becomes too heavy to carry and someone finally decides to speak. Maybe you've spent years honoring peace at the cost of truth. Maybe you've walked past something that didn't sit right, told yourself it wasn't your place to stir things up. And maybe, like Clara, you've known what it feels like to stand next to someone, whether in a marriage, a workplace, or a tight-knit community, and feel more alone than ever. This tale reminds us that justice isn't a badge, and goodness isn't just the absence of wrongdoing. Sometimes being quiet doesn't make us loyal, it makes us complicit. And truth, when spoken too late, can turn into regret that lingers longer than grief. But it also shows that change doesn't always arrive in grand declarations. It can begin with a single decision to speak up, to remember, to choose not to look away. Clara didn't save the town. She didn't fix the past. But she honored the voice of a girl who'd been forgotten, and in doing so, reclaimed her own. That's something each of us can do no matter how long we've held our silence. Whether it's standing up for someone who isn't in the room, questioning what's always been just the way it is, or finally listening to the quiet warnings our gut has whispered for years. There is power in choosing to no longer look the other way. You've just heard one powerful story, but many more remain untold. Click to discover more raw, gripping, deeply human tales from the Wild West.